My sister, Clara, and I were two halves of the same whole. That's what it felt like for most of our lives. We grew up in a house filled with noise and love, our days a blur of shared secrets and inside jokes. We built forts from blankets and dreamed up futures where we would live next door to each other, our own children becoming the best of friends. Our bond was the solid ground beneath my feet, a truth I never thought to question. We were more than sisters. We were collaborators in the grand, messy project of growing up. Our memories were woven together so tightly I couldn't tell where mine ended and hers began. Our family was a loud, sprawling universe, and Clara and I were its twin sons. We navigated everything together, from scraped knees to our first heartbreaks. I was the one she called when her car broke down in the rain, and she was the one who brought me soup when I was sick. We had a language that needed no words. A simple glance across a crowded room was enough to convey entire conversations. This connection felt unbreakable, a sacred pact forged in childhood and strengthened over years of unwavering support. It was the cornerstone of my identity, the one relationship I believed would weather any storm that life could possibly throw at us. We had plans, big, beautiful plans. We talked for hours about being each other's maid of honor, about the speeches we would give that would make everyone both laugh and cry. I imagined standing beside her, holding the bouquet, my heart swelling with pride as she said her vows. It was a scene I had replayed in my mind 1,000 times, a future so certain it felt like a memory I already owned. This shared dream was not just a casual fantasy, it was a promise, a fundamental part of the story we were writing together. It was the next logical chapter in our shared history, a celebration of her love that would also be a celebration of our sisterhood. The years leading up to her engagement were no different. We were inseparable. When she met Mark, I was her most trusted confidant. I listened to her gush about their first date and helped her dissect his every text message. I loved him because she loved him. I saw the way his presence made her shine, and her happiness became my own. I felt like an integral part of their love story. The supportive sister cheering from the sidelines, eagerly awaiting the day I would stand beside them. There was no hint of a fracture, no warning sign of the earthquake that was about to rupture the very foundation of my world. I found out about my exclusion not with a bang, but with a deafening silence. The save the dates had been mailed, a fact I learned from a cousin who called to ask if I had booked my flight yet. A cold dread washed over me as she spoke, her cheerful words turning into a meaningless buzz in my ears. I mumbled something about it getting lost in the mail and hung up, my hand trembling. For days I checked the mailbox with a frantic, desperate hope. Each day it was empty of the cream-colored envelope I pictured in my mind. The absence of that invitation was louder than any argument, more painful than any cruel word could ever be. My first reaction was denial, a deep and stubborn refusal to believe it was intentional. There had to be a mistake, a simple oversight. I crafted a dozen innocent explanations in my head. Maybe they ran out. Maybe they were hand-delivering mine. I replayed our last few conversations, searching for a clue, a wrong step, a hidden offense. But there was nothing. Just the normal, easy rhythm of our sisterhood. The confusion was a thick fog, making it hard to breathe. The pain was a sharp, physical ache in my chest, a constant pressure that reminded me something was terribly, fundamentally wrong with my world. The confirmation came indirectly through a series of awkward, evasive phone calls with my mother. She would change the subject, her voice strained when I brought up the wedding. "Clara's just so busy," she'd say, or "it's a very small affair." Each excuse was a paper-thin veil over a truth I couldn't bear to see. The final crushing blow was seeing a photo online, a picture of the bridal party, filled with our cousins and Clara's new friends. I was not among them. Seeing their smiling faces, all of them in on the secret, all of them part of her circle while I was on the outside, shattered me. The denial crumbled, leaving only raw, unprocessed grief. The shock was immense, a tidal wave that swept away every certainty I had about my family and my place in it. How could this happen? The sister who held my hand through every storm had now cast me out into one of my own, without a word of explanation. The why became a torturous obsession, a question that echoed in the lonely chambers of my heart. Was our entire history a lie? Was the love I felt not truly reciprocated? The feeling was one of profound betrayal, not just by her, but by everyone who knew and said nothing. I was an outsider in my own family, a ghost haunting a life I thought was mine. In the suffocating silence that followed, I made a decision. It wasn't born of anger, Not at first. It was born of a deep, instinctual need for self-preservation. Staying felt impossible. How could I face them at holiday dinners? How could I pretend that a gaping wound hadn't been torn into the fabric of our family? Every cheerful, "How are you?" would feel like a lie. So, I chose to vanish. I didn't announce it with a dramatic exit. I simply stopped answering the phone. I let the texts go unread. I faded away, slipping out of their lives as quietly as a whisper, hoping the distance would somehow cauterize the wound. This choice was not easy. It felt like severing a limb. My family, for all its emerging flaws, was my home. The thought of voluntarily stepping away from them, from the familiar chaos of Sunday dinners and the comfort of my mother's hugs, was terrifying. Yet the alternative seemed worse. To stay would be to accept the unacceptable, to tacitly agree that my feelings didn't matter. It would mean swallowing a mountain of pain and pretending it wasn't there. I needed space to understand what had happened, to grieve the loss of my sister, and to figure out who I was without her as my other half. Disappearing was an act of survival. My vanishing act was total. I changed my phone number and deactivated my social media accounts, cutting off the channels through which their world could bleed into mine. I needed a clean break, a true exile. I didn't want to see pictures of the wedding, of my family celebrating without me. I didn't want to receive half-hearted apologies or be subjected to awkward conversations. I was building a fortress around my broken heart, and the only way to do that was to cut all ties. It was a lonely, drastic measure, but it felt like the only way I could begin to breathe again, to find air that wasn't choked with betrayal. The silence I created was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it protected me from further hurt. I no longer had to brace myself for the next casual cruelty or evasive comment. The constant, low-level anxiety of waiting for a call began to subside. On the other hand, the silence was a vast, empty space that I now had to fill all by myself. It was a wilderness of my own making. In choosing to disappear from their lives, I had also made myself disappear from my own history. I was untethered, a ship cut loose from its moorings, drifting into an unknown and uncertain future. It was the hardest thing I had ever done. At first, my absence was likely met with confusion, perhaps even annoyance. I imagined my mother trying my old number, my father leaving voicemails that started with anger and softened into concern. They were used to me being there, being the reliable one, the steady presence. My sudden silence must have been jarring. From the snippets I heard later, through a distant relative, their initial reaction was not one of introspection. It was a narrative of me being dramatic or overly sensitive. It was easier for them to paint me as the problem than to confront the uncomfortable truth of what they, as a family, had allowed to happen. The attempts to contact me became more frantic for a time. Emails I never opened piled up. A letter or two arrived at my old apartment, which my landlord forwarded. I glanced at the familiar handwriting and felt a pang of sorrow, but I couldn't bring myself to open them. I knew what they would say. They would be filled with justifications, with pleas to be the bigger person, to forgive and forget for the sake of the family. They would be about managing the conflict, not healing the wound. Their outreach felt less about understanding my pain and more about restoring the family's comfortable equilibrium, the one I had disrupted by refusing to play my part. The most telling reaction was from Clara herself. There was none. In all the secondhand reports I heard, she remained silent. She did not call, she did not write. It was as if my disappearance was a relief to her, a problem that had conveniently solved itself. This silence was the most painful confirmation of all. It told me that her decision was not a mistake or an oversight. It was a deliberate choice. She had cut me out of her life, and my decision to formalize that separation by disappearing simply made it official. Her lack of response told me everything I needed to know about the depth of the rift between us. As weeks turned into months, their efforts dwindled. The calls stopped. The emails ceased. My absence became the new normal, a quiet, unspoken fact of their lives. The family closed ranks, creating a new story that didn't include me. They learned to pose for photos with a missing space where I used to stand. They celebrated birthdays and holidays, and my name became a ghost, a topic to be avoided. Their ability to move on so completely was, in its own way, more shocking than the initial exclusion. It showed me that the family unit I had believed in was more fragile and more conditional than I had ever imagined. The solitude I had chosen was a stark, empty landscape at first. The silence I had craved was now a constant companion, and honestly, it was often deafening. My days, once punctuated by calls and texts from my sister and mom, were now structured only by my own routines. I would go to work, come home, and the quiet of my apartment would just press in on me. There were moments of profound, gut-wrenching loneliness, especially on Sundays, which had always been family day. I would see other families at the park or in the grocery store and feel a sharp, stabbing envy for their easy, unthinking togetherness. During this time apart, my emotions were a wild, unpredictable sea. Grief was the most powerful current, a deep, pulling tide of loss for the sister I thought I had, for the family I believed was mine. There was anger too, a hot, righteous fury that would flare up at unexpected moments. But underneath it all was a bedrock of sadness. I was mourning a living person. I was grieving a relationship that hadn't ended in death, but in a choice. This kind of grief is complicated because there is no closure, no final goodbye, just a lingering, painful question mark. Yet, slowly, something began to shift within the silence. The empty space started to feel less like a void and more like an opportunity. Without the constant noise of my family's expectations and dramas, I could finally hear my own voice. I started to do things just for me. I took up hiking, finding a strange comfort in the solitude of the mountains. I started journaling, pouring all the unspoken words onto the page. I was rediscovering myself, not as a sister or a daughter, but simply as a person. The solitude, once a punishment, was gradually transforming into a sanctuary for healing. There were days when the temptation to reach out was almost overwhelming. I would draft a text, my thumb hovering over the send button, a desperate urge to break the silence and demand an answer. But I never did. I knew deep down that I wasn't ready. The wound was still too raw, and I hadn't yet learned how to live with the scar. This period of isolation was a necessary crucible. It was painful, it was lonely, but it was also forcing me to build a strength I never knew I possessed. It was teaching me that I could survive on my own, that my worth was not dependent on my place within the family. Living in the quiet space I had carved out for myself held up a mirror, and what I saw was, well, complicated. At first, I only saw my own pain and righteousness. I was the victim, the one who had been wronged. My narrative was simple and clear. But as the months wore on, the picture became more nuanced. I began to see my own role in the family dynamic. I had always been the peacemaker, the one who smoothed over conflicts and absorbed others' emotions just to keep things stable. I realized that my identity was so wrapped up in being the good daughter and the supportive sister that I had forgotten how to have my own needs. This experience forced me to confront my own fear of conflict. My decision to vanish, while necessary for my survival, was also an avoidance of a difficult conversation. It was just easier to disappear than to stand my ground and demand to be heard. I saw that I had a pattern of making myself small to make others comfortable. The wedding snub was not an isolated incident, but the culmination of a lifetime of tiny compromises, of putting my family's needs ahead of my own until my own needs became invisible, even to me. This was a difficult and humbling realization. From this painful new perspective, I also started to see my family more clearly. I saw them not as villains, but as flawed human beings operating from their own fears and limitations. My sister, perhaps, was so overwhelmed by the pressures of her wedding and her new life that she made a selfish, cowardly choice. My mother, caught between her two daughters, chose the path of least resistance, hoping the problem would just go away. Their actions weren't necessarily born of malice, but of a profound emotional immaturity. They didn't know how to handle difficult feelings, so they simply pretended they didn't exist. What I discovered about myself was that I was stronger than I thought. Surviving this betrayal and the subsequent isolation proved that my foundation was not my family, it was me. I learned that I could set boundaries, that I could say no to pain, even if it meant walking away from people I loved. I was no longer the girl who would do anything to keep the peace. The wedding snub, as devastating as it was, had inadvertently given me a gift, the permission to finally choose myself. It was a brutal, painful lesson, but it was also the beginning of a more authentic, self-possessed life. The distance gave me a new vantage point, like looking at my family home from a faraway hill. From here, I could see the cracks in the foundation that I had been too close to notice before. I realized that our family's closeness was often conditional. It thrived on agreement and smooth surfaces. We were great at celebrating successes and rallying in straightforward crises. But we were terrible at navigating internal conflict, at holding space for hurt feelings or differing perspectives. Disagreement was seen as a threat to the family's unity, so it was quickly swept under the rug, leaving unresolved issues to fester in the dark. I began to remember other instances, small snubs and quiet dismissals from the past that I had previously brushed off. Times when my opinion was discounted or my feelings were minimized for the sake of harmony. The wedding wasn't a sudden aberration. It was the loudest manifestation of a long-standing pattern. My sister's choice to exclude me was enabled by a family system that prioritized appearance over authenticity. No one was willing to challenge her, to ask the hard questions, because doing so would have meant acknowledging that our perfect family was, in fact, deeply fractured. This new understanding was both liberating and deeply saddening. It was liberating because it meant I wasn't crazy. My pain was valid. It wasn't just a case of me being too sensitive, it was a legitimate reaction to a dysfunctional dynamic. But it was also sad, because it meant that the family I had cherished was, in many ways, an illusion. The unconditional love I thought was our bedrock was actually quite conditional, dependent on everyone playing their assigned roles. My role had been the peacekeeper, and when I could no longer play it, I was cast out. I learned that family is not just about blood or shared history. True family is about showing up for each other when it's hard. It's about having the courage to have the messy, painful conversations. It's about loving someone enough to tell them when they're wrong and being willing to hear it in return. My family, as I had known it, had failed this test. The wedding snub was the final exam, and everyone had either failed or refused to show up. This realization was harsh, but it was also the truth, and living in the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than living in a comfortable lie. Nearly 2 years after the wedding, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, my new phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "It's Mark," it read, "Clara's husband. Can I call you?" My heart hammered against my ribs. I hadn't spoken to anyone from that life in so long. After a moment of hesitation, I typed back a simple, "Yes." His call came immediately. His voice was hesitant, full of a guilt that wasn't entirely his own. He told me he was sorry. He said that not insisting I be at the wedding was the biggest regret of his marriage. He said that Clara was not the same, that my absence had left a shadow over everything. He explained, without making excuses, that Clara had been under immense pressure from our mother, who had her own complicated history with weddings and family status. There had been arguments I never knew about, and in a moment of weakness and a misguided attempt to please everyone else, Clara had made a terrible choice. Mark told me that she had been miserable ever since, trapped in a prideful silence she didn't know how to break. He wasn't asking for my forgiveness, he said. He was just asking if, one day, I might be willing to hear his wife out. It was the first crack of light in a long, dark tunnel. This unexpected olive branch threw me into turmoil. A part of me, the wounded part, wanted to reject it immediately. It was too little, too late. The damage was done. But another part of me, the part that had spent 2 years grieving the loss of my sister, felt a flicker of hope. Mark's call was not a demand or a justification. It was a humble, honest admission of fault. It was the first time anyone from that side of the chasm had acknowledged the depth of my pain. It didn't erase what had happened, but it changed the texture of the silence. I did not respond right away. I let his words settle for a few weeks. I had built a new life for myself, a life that was quiet and stable. Was I willing to risk that peace by reopening the door to all that pain? The surprise was not just the call itself, but my reaction to it. I found that I wasn't as angry as I thought I would be. The intense work I had done on myself had created a space for something other than rage. I was still hurt, but I was also curious. I was curious to see if the sister I had lost was still in there somewhere, buried under all that pain and pride. In the end, I agreed to meet Clara. We met in a neutral place, a small coffee shop halfway between our two worlds. Seeing her for the first time in years was like looking at a ghost. She was thinner, and the light in her eyes that I remembered so well was dimmed. The first few minutes were excruciatingly awkward, filled with the weight of everything unsaid. Then she began to cry, quiet, racking sobs. Through her tears, she told me she was sorry. She said it wasn't an excuse, but she had been lost, confused, and had made the worst decision of her life. She had been too ashamed to face me ever since. Forgiveness is not a switch you can flip. It's a slow, arduous journey, and I'm still on it. Hearing her apology didn't magically heal the wound. The scar is still there, a pale, jagged line on my heart that reminds me of the damage that was done. But listening to her, I saw not a monster but my flawed human sister. I saw her weakness and her regret. And in that moment, I realized that holding on to my anger was like drinking poison and expecting her to be the one who suffered. It was only hurting me, keeping me tethered to the worst day of my life. We are not the sisters we used to be. That innocent, unbreakable bond is gone forever. We cannot go back. But we are slowly, cautiously building something new. It's a relationship built on a more honest foundation. It's quieter, more deliberate. We are learning to talk about the hard things, to respect each other's boundaries. There are still moments of mistrust, echoes of the betrayal that linger between us. But there are also moments of grace, glimpses of the old connection that remind me of what we lost and what we might one day regain in a new form. I don't know if I will ever fully forgive and forget. Perhaps some things are not meant to be forgotten. Perhaps the memory of that pain is a necessary reminder of the importance of choosing myself, of speaking my truth. What I have found is not a perfect resolution, but a form of peace. It's the peace that comes from accepting reality, from letting go of the need for a perfect past, and from having the courage to step into an uncertain future. I moved forward by learning that I can survive being broken, and that healing isn't about erasing the scars, but about learning to live with them.